This is the fifth in the Reflections on the Dante Eliot course. I'd like today to discuss the Ariel poems of Eliot, the late 1920s, early 1930s. Eliot was making the transition from the early poetry in which there was a sense of hopelessness. It was like the many poems he wrote, whether it's the proof rock ones, whether it's the Garantian ones, whether it's the Sweeney, the Hollow Man. There's a sense of anew, a sense of what is worth living for, what is worth choosing in an age essentially of mirages and cellars of smoke. And he'd reached the end of that particular way of understanding identity, the self, and how you live. And he began to make the turn in the late 1920s to Christianity. And out of this period of time came a series of books, one on Dante himself, the Ariel poems, which I'll briefly discuss, Ash Wednesday, his essays after Lambeth in the early 30s. And so there is this deepening interest in both Christianity and the form of Christianity was Church of England itself. The Ariel poems, often most ones that are focused on are the first four, which are Journey of the Magi, Song of Simeon, Enamula, and then Marina. But there's the following two also, which are very important and brings together six of the poems. These poems were published between 1927 and 1954, which was the cultivation of Christmas trees. But they form a nice package, as it were, of Eliot's own journey in terms of a deepening understanding of himself, the world he lived in, and just the nature of the human journey from the time one is young to the midlife journey, and then coming in the autumn seasons of the journey. What choices were made that were worth making, what not? What are the consequences of making certain choices that take a person in a certain path? What are the best choices worth making? How does one consciously and thoughtfully make those choices rather than just being driven along by the winds of time and circumstance and undealt with thinking in one's soul? So let me just touch on four, which are usually in most collections. The latter two often don't factor in, but they're very good poems as well, and certainly worth noting. But I'll just touch on Journey of the Magi, which was the first of the Ariel poems. And it's a story of the wise men who came to see Christ. Now, Eliot frames it in the context. Obviously, they're wealthy people. The people who, immersed in wisdom, they sense that something's afoot. They are people who read books, stars, astrology. There's various messages that whisper wisdom and direction to them. But they're used to a certain level of security, predictability, wealth, affluence. So to leave that behind, which is a sort of a death for them, and to go on this trip. This is why the poem starts with a cold coming we had of it, or a hard time we've had of it, because they're leaving behind much that they took for granted in terms of their lifestyle, and they're heading out across deserts. So here we have an important metaphor, what Eliot is going to be dealing with, leaving the pomp and the plenty of wealthy cities into the desert, and even the people they hired were not predictable. And so it's a kind of a death. And this is why the poem itself ends with, when we go on these journeys of discovery or listening or seeing more important things, it is a kind of a death. And the Journey of the Magi is really about the Magi reflecting on that decision earlier in their life. That experience is now over and done, and they're reflecting on the significance and how it was a kind of a death for them, a death of understanding themselves, their lifestyle, the journey they made, the difficulty of that journey. And it's a powerful poem as part of the Ariel series. Fine little metaphors on it that, in one sense, conjure up what's about to happen, like in Three Trees on the Low Sky. So what's the three trees? Well, now you're into the crucifixion of Christ. And an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands at the open door, dicing for pieces of silver. Pieces of silver obviously takes you right into the Judas situation. And so not only is it the trip somewhere, but many of the images Eliot is using are anticipating the future, which even the Magi were not aware of themselves. As these images came to them, but they did not know the meaning of the images, they only understood the images retrospectively. And so what Eliot is suggesting that constantly, if we're alert, the future is coming before us through certain activities and images, but if we don't have the ability to know how to read and interpret the image, we will only understand it retrospectively. And it's in this sense, the journey of the Magi is very good in that sense. As he says, it was a long time ago, I remember. But the reflecting on, it was death, and they had seen death in life, the Magi had. But whose death was it, and whose birth was it? Well, obviously it was the birth of Christ, but that would also lead to the death. But it was also their death in having to let go of a way of life in which they were pampered to some degree, petted to some degree, but they also had to make decisions to let go of that way of life. And then in doing so, they were not content in the old dispensation anymore, because they had seen too much to live the way they had once lived. And the question was then, how are they lived forward into their life journey, given what they had witnessed, what they had seen, and what they were now able to read about their past as it moved into the future. The next one is a song of Simeon. So this is also like the journey of the Magi, a Christmas one. Simeon, when Christ was brought to the temple, was there, and it's the story of him. He was a person 80 in the poem. He had given his life as much as he could to living his life within the Jewish tradition seriously. He had read the signs of the times, as had the Magi. When Christ was brought in, he knew something was about to occur. He sensed it, but he also was aware that the coming of Christ was going to lead to difficult times for those who followed. So he's ready to leave this life at 80. He's grateful that he's been around to see what he had seen, but he knows that his time is up. And like feathers on his hand, his life is about to be blown away. And so the Song of Simeon is a very touching and tender, but again, someone reflecting on their past, how they have lived, was how they lived worthwhile, what decisions were made that were meaningful, what were not, but being able at the end of his life to be given the gift of seeing the Christ child. So Song of Simeon is the second of the series, very, very much in that, and he says, let thy servant depart, having seen thy salvation. But he also talks to many people when they think about religion, they want the ecstatic experience. They want something intense, for real. He says, not for me the martyrdom, the ecstasy of thought and prayer, not for me the ultimate vision. So he lived a life quietly but with integrity. He was not on the front stage all the time. He was not a high flyer. He just was faithful and steady over the long haul. And this is the song of Simeon, very important. But these two poems are taken from biblical images. The next one is Animula, in which he'd write from Dante. The first line is, which issues from the hand of God, the simple soul. Issues from the hand of God, the simple soul. The first part of the poem is very much similar to William Blake's Songs of Innocence. A young child comes forth. Their life is one of curiosity and excitement and insecurities and fears. And the first part of the poem just reflects on the energy and the innocence of a young child that has not experienced life, has not faced into the tragedies, the difficult elements of life. The second part of Animula is the story of someone facing into what Blake will call the songs of experience, in which decisions are hard to make. What is important? Decisions are worth making. What are not? And people can be paralyzed by too many possibilities and not having the ability to discern proper focus for the soul, for their vocation, for their journey. And so Animula, the simple soul, as it were, which is all of us on the journey, if we are not careful, then we get stalled in life. the important decisions are not made because we don't know how to make them, and there's so many possibilities. And this is why this particular poem ends with particularly, which is interesting. It's a prayer, which is usually pray for us now and at the hour of our death. He ends with pray for us now at the hour of our birth, because it is birth itself that opens the gates for the journey through time and how we live that life. We can easily become paralyzed if we do not know how to make significant decisions on the journey itself. The final one is Maria in this section. It's the story of a man he's a sailor, so we can pick up the metaphor of the Ulysses parable and Homer's work on this. Eliot himself had a great affinity with the sea, with water, with sailing. And it's the sailor coming, like Simeon itself, like the Magi. So in most of these poems, in fact, you've got someone who's lived their 70 or shorter and longer, and they're looking back on their life lived, reflecting on what were the decisions I could have made, I did not make, which of course we're going to get in 4 quartets. What the decisions I did made, which led to problematic consequences. What were the good decisions that were made? And so Marina is the story of the sailor. It's really a poem to his daughter, Marina. And we can see Mary in something like this as well. And so these 4 poems in the Ariel series are really someone looking back on their journey from their 10, 20, 30, 40. Each decision itself birthing certain consequences that lead to certain responsibilities, accountability, and how could decisions have been made differently? How were they made good? And what are the consequences everyone has to live with based on a combination of decisions made? And so the Ariel poems are a fascinating study in that sense of choices, consequences over the span of the decades. The other, which we'll be looking at this week, is Murder in the Cathedral. Murder in the Cathedral, Eliot begins to turn in the 1930s to drama. So he moves a bit away from poetry for a short season as he turns to drama as a means of articulating what's important. Important play he did was The Rock, and the choruses in The Rock, which I'll reflect on in the next time I'm together, the story is about a church being built, and the question is, why would anybody bother being a church increasingly in an age of secularism when religion seems to be on the wane? Is this just foolishness? Is this foolhardiness, a fool's errand in that sense? But the choruses in The Rock are very, very powerful in terms of a culture given itself to a hyper-drivenness, a lack of inner reflectiveness. When knowledge and technical skills dominate, where is wisdom? Where is love? Where is community? So what is the rock that holds things together over the long haul in terms of the winds of time that blow the leaves of the human journey and history and identity all over the place? Is there a rock that people can build, stand firmly on, that holds them over the journey? And so the choruses in The Rock are some of the most powerful, actually, prose poems written by Eliot. But the play I want to discuss now is Murder in the Cathedral. Both were written in the early mid-1930s. Important to get the background for this is because the 1930s was the rise of fascism and Nazism, fascism in Italy. One of Eliot's close friends, as many of that generation, were looking for some rock themselves, but they often turned to the wrong rock, which would betray them. And Pound turned to Mussolini in Italy, as this was going to be the great rebuilding of the Roman Empire. Eliot was too bright to see through that. And so what is the rock that is worth standing on, worth building in that sense? But Murder in the Cathedral, set in the 1930s, this is a period of time in what puts the relationship of church to state. And so Murder in the Cathedral goes back to the killing of Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in the 12th century. And Henry II and Becket grew up as very, very close friends. So Henry, who embodies the state in that sense, thought by appointing Becket, who embodied the church, Archbishop of Canterbury, the church would do the bidding of the state, given their friendship. And Henry was completely convinced that by asking Becket to be archbishop, there would be no tensions between church and state anymore. But in fact, as Becket became Canterbury, he realized his calling and vocation was different than merely being a compliant servant to the state. This is important, for just as the Rock is important as two plays in the 30s, because what was happening in Germany and Italy and Spain and other parts of Europe at the time, this was the rise of the Brown Church, the rise of fascism and Nazism. So what is the relationship to be between church and state, particularly, and further north was communism itself. Certainly in Germany, there was a significant number of Lutherans who capitulated to Hitler, Roman Catholics who capitulated to Mussolini. And so what Eliot is doing, he's taking the issue of Becket and Henry II, a historic incident, he's fast forwarding that to the 1930s. He very clearly in The Rock goes after the Brown Shirts. He sees, and this is what was happening in England as well, the rise of fascists in England that were emerging, very, very much attuned to what was happening in Germany and Italy. In Spain as well, and so and obviously communism in the USSR. And so the Murder in the Cathedral is an exploration of what happens when the church refuses to genuflect to a state which by its very nature is totalitarian, it's authoritarian. And it's an exquisite study by Eliot of the complex nature of Becket himself, who's engaging not only larger political, economic, social issues, but his own inner life. And Eliot is a master of describing the inner landscape of Becket as well as the external reality when he returns to France. And so the chorus in Murder in the Cathedral are women who they're very anxious. They're very concerned with Becket coming back because they know it's going to be a horn-biting session with not only Henry, but those who he has essentially assigned to do in Becket. They're the ones who just see the negative, the negative, the negative of what's coming. And some of the very graphic and descriptive language by the chorus of women could easily have kept Becket from returning. His priests are keen to have him come, but they're equally worried because they know with his 7 years in France, his support of the Pope, and then working with the King of France, that he has a lot of support from Europe and the papacy, but in returning to England, Henry II is not supportive of Becket's return. And so the complex story of Murder in the Cathedral, the underlying issue for Eliot, and given the time the play was out, it raised the question, what is the relationship of the church to state in troubled times, in periods of time when the state has become totalitarian, authoritarian, and the church is expected to capitulate, go on bended knee to the state itself. So Murder in the Cathedral not only is a historic play, but that it was written for the Canterbury Festival at a time in the midst of the 1930s in which he was obviously zeroing in the period of time in which fascism, Nazism, communism was very, very much waxing at the time. Very interesting, it was Bishop Bell he was Bishop of Chichester. He was the one who asked Eliot to write the play, and there's a very interesting background to Bishop Bell. Bishop Bell had developed a very close friendship with Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was at the forefront in the 1930s, one of the leading Lutheran theologians and pastors, of critiquing the rise of Nazism in Germany. He had come over to the United States, and many people warned him not to go back to Germany, given his vigorous critique of National Socialism and Hitler and the Lutheran Church itself, which is largely capitulating to Hitler. Bishop Bell, when the bombings took place in Germany, many expected Bishop Bell would be the one who would be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. But because he was probably the most vigorous opponent of the English bombing of civilian cities in Germany, whereas Bishop Temple was much more the nationalist who felt, given the bombings of England by the Germans, the English had uncritical right to bomb cities in Germany, and some which were just civilian cities. Bishop Bell, given his friendship with Bonhoeffer, his understanding of the complex nature of Germany in the 1930s, he took the position that he was very critical of the English military again and again when it bombed significant civilian cities in Germany, which were not military centers, not just like the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the Americans in 1945. And so given his critique of the militaristic nationalism of the English in terms of the bombing in Germany, the war was over. Bishop Bell never got the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, whereas Temple did, because he was an uncritical nationalist in support of the military. Now, T.S. Eliot and Bishop Bell of Chichester and Dietrich Bonhoeffer were on the same page in many of these issues. And so the role of the church and the state in Murder in the Cathedral, the backdrop of it is set within the historic reality of the 1930s and the leadership in the Church of England, which was critical of the English state as well as it was of the German state in trying to articulate a higher position than both sort of the lackeys in Germany and the people in England itself, in which trying to find a third way, and how the church at its best was to be an agent of justice and peace, not an agent of intensifying and accelerating the war mood or genuflecting, as it were, to Mars himself in a situation like this. So when we read The Rock or Murder in the Cathedral, absolutely important to set it in the context of the late 1920s and certainly the intensity of violence and war and political polarization of the 1930s and 1940s, and Eliot's friendship with Bishop Bell and Dietrich Bonhoeffer have to be brought together in understanding the roots of A Murder in the Cathedral and how Eliot uses a historic play and then fast forwards it to the situation at the time in the late 20s, 30s, and 40s. And he argues that the church's vision must be much higher than the politics of the right and left, and to be wary of any time the church is taken in by a certain type of statecraft that undermines, is very similar in many ways to Augustine's great work, The City of God, the two cities, or you get in Tolkien's the two towers, Isengard and Mordor, and what happens when the city of God or Isengard capitulates to Mordor. It's exactly the same mythic structure between what happens when wisdom itself, out of fear, capitulates to power itself. And so what Augustine was doing in the City of God, what Tolkien is doing with Two Towers and Lord of the Rings, this is the same thing that Eliot is dealing with in Murder in the Cathedral, but grounding it in the historic context of the 1930s and 1940s. So the Ariel poems are very important. They seem to have a much more of a, obviously, a personal element, an interpersonal element. But in The Rock and Murder in the Cathedral, Eliot is also drawing from, in this sense, Dante and the Commedia, because Dante was also a political philosopher, and people often reading the Commedia will take the personal, the interpersonal, the ecclesial, and ignore the political. But in fact, to study Dante as a political philosopher is again to enter into the realm of the relationship of the church and the state. Dante was very clear that the church should never, and under no conditions, see itself as either dominating the state, what we call C0 papism or the Constantinian settlement. On the other hand, it should never be an uncritical servant of the state, very similar to Thomas More's state. I'm the king's good servant, but God's first. And when there is a clash, More, like Dante, like Eliot, were very aware in the public realm, what positions they were to take. And so we think of Dante's Commedia, the political element, because it's shot through with politics, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. Eliot is drawing from the wisdom, in many ways, of Dante's political philosophy, but he's articulating it in shorter little excerpts. Dante's Commedia is an expansive cathedral in itself. What Eliot is doing in much of his writings, he's not doing the big epic work of Dante, but he's doing the same epic vision, but he's articulating it in smaller little pieces. And anyone who reads Dante and knows how to put together the pieces of the puzzle of his epic vision of faith, it's very similar and mirrors in most way what Dante is doing, not only in Commedia, but his Monarchia and his Convivio as well. And so their themes are the same, Dante and Eliot, church and politics, but the means they are using to articulate the expansive cathedral-like vision is different methodologically, but the content of it is much the same. And so in thinking what Eliot is doing in Murder in a Cathedral and The Rock, if you just walk backwards to Dante, then we can see how Eliot has dipped his bucket into the rich political philosophy of Dante and many of his works, but does so in a very different manner than Eliot, but they're on the same page when it comes to political philosophy and the relationship of church and state.